Like the fingers of a giant, gnarled hand, the lochs of the Firth of Clyde spread north into the mountains of the Southern Highlands. These wild and surprisingly remote lands are where the sea lochs of the west coast meet the people of Scotland, because being so close to the big cities of the Central Belt, they became favourite destinations for those seeking to escape the pace of modern life. These are the people's lochs. In Scotland, lochs are everywhere, cutting in from the coast as long fjord-like sea lochs, nestling between mountains as great freshwater lochs, and scattered across the landscape as tiny lochans. And to appreciate them better, I'm on a loch-hopping journey across the country. In this programme, I'm sailing a much-loved route through the Kyles of Bute to Dunoon. From there, I'll get nostalgic about nuclear submarines in a hallowed loch before navigating the famous Ship Loch to discover how a mountain became a setting for the high aspirations of working people. For this grand tour, I'm heading to the Lochs of the Clyde. My journey starts at Tynebruch on the Cowal Peninsula, heads through the Kyles to Dunoon and the neighbouring Holy Loch, goes o'er the hills to Ardentiny and sails up Loch Long to a mighty little peak. Sitting on an arm of the sea known as the Kyles of Bute is the picturesque little village of Tynebruch, which in Gaelic means the house on the hill. Today there are lots of houses on the hill, most of them dating back to Victorian times, when Tynebruch was a favourite holiday destination for Glaswegians sailing down the water to Clyde coastal resorts. Until the early 1970s, pleasure steamers sailed through this narrow channel on a daily basis, transporting passengers and goods from the noise and bustle of the city to the scenic west coast. To find out more about this bygone route, I've come aboard the MV Morag to chat to skipper Donald Clark.
It was the advent of the steamer that created Tynebruch in the 1830s. As a result of that, the Victorians could build their holiday homes. The rich Victorian shipyard owners, tobacco barons, shipping magnates, and Tynebruch flourished. It became a holiday resort, as did all the other resorts around the Clyde. But Tynebruch became a bit of an upmarket holiday resort.
Oh, really? Like the Saint-Tropez of the Clyde Riviera.
We had the very best midges. They'd move their families down for the summer, and the gentlemen would get on board a steamer on a Monday morning at 6 o'clock, and they'd be in the Broomielaw, right in the heart of Glasgow, for 9 o'clock, ready to start work.
Well, you couldn't do that now, could you?
You can't get to Glasgow Airport in 2 hours.
I doubt there are many people commuting through the Kyles these days, but it's still a beautiful journey and a peaceful escape from the central cities. As we navigate through the Narrows, the landscape opens up and we meet the entrance to Loch Striven. Surprisingly wild and remote, this was an ideal place for secret wartime experiments. It's amazing to think that a child's game of skimming stones once led to the development of a weapon of mass destruction. Joining me on the pier is Dr. Ian Murray, who's been investigating the remarkable link between Loch Striven and one of Britain's most ingenious weapons.
Well, in 1943, this was one of the most top secret places in Scotland. You had the bouncing bomb being tested here.
Bouncing bombs, I'm thinking of Barnes Wallis and the Dam Buster bomb. Was it that bomb that was actually being tested?
No, it was actually a variation on that bomb. It was a smaller version which they wanted to use to attack shipping with. It worked on exactly the same principle as the Dams bomb, and it was developed at the same time. But they tested it here. They had a battleship positioned in the loch, and aeroplanes would come flying low up the loch and drop the bomb against the battleship here.
What did they call this weapon?
It was called highball, for attacking battleships, essentially, primarily the Tirpitz.
The highball never saw action, but it may look familiar because it has a starring role in one of our most celebrated war films.
Did it look very similar to the famous Dam Buster bomb?
It looks very similar. The shots that you see of it bouncing in the famous film were filmed here.
Really? I had no idea. So what we're seeing when we watch the movie, the Dam Busters, when they drop the bomb, it's actually filmed out here.
Actually, Lochs, yeah.
It's amazing to think that this peaceful backwater played a crucial part in developing and showcasing such a legendary weapon. Looking at the loch today, you'd never guess. Continuing my grand tour, I head up the Firth of Clyde to Dunoon, the largest town on the Cowal Peninsula and once the jewel in the crown of holidaymakers going doon the water, and the place where I went to secondary school.
This is Dunoon Pier, which for me is a very nostalgic location because it was from here that I began and ended many of my early travels around Scotland and beyond.
For passengers stepping off the Glasgow steamers, the pier was the beginning of their fortnight in Dunoon, which was trying its very best to present an aura of sophistication, as this old promotional poster from the 1930s shows. It's a view of the West Bay and the glorious new Art Deco bathing lido, which makes Dunoon look almost like Monte Carlo, but perhaps without the money. Sadly, the lido was demolished years ago, along with the dream.
Dunoon's fortunes as a holiday destination began to suffer in the 1950s and 60s when cheap flights to Spain and the Mediterranean made foreign holidays and guaranteed sunshine suddenly affordable. And very quickly, people began to desert the Clyde Riviera and the people's lochs.
But while other Clyde resorts went into decline, Dunoon was thrown an unexpected lifeline by the US Navy. In 1961, the nearby Holy Loch became the base for a squadron of Polaris nuclear submarines. At the height of activities, there were over 4,000 US personnel and their families stationed at what was called Site 1. It's a period I well remember. Suzanne Bonner also grew up nearby and has a personal link to the Americans.
You've got a very special connection to the American base that was here because your father was American himself and served aboard.
He certainly did. He was Chief Petty Officer on the ship, and he met my mum, and I was born. The rest history. And I remember a lot of the old style uniforms with the white piping and the white hats. And it definitely got that feeling of America.
You did. It was a wee mini America here. Mm-hmm. When you think back on it, actually, the American presence did give the people around the shore here a sense of a wider world, a more cosmopolitan world.
And that's the thing I think I remember, actually, as a child, you were just looking out. I remember thinking, gosh, there is a world out there.
For over 30 years, US submarines came and went. A mixed blessing for the area, perhaps. I personally took part in demonstrations against the nuclear threat as I saw it. Then in March 1992, the mothership sailed away for good, leaving the loch suddenly empty.
It wasn't until that day I thought, gosh, that's been my history, that's been a part of me, and actually it was probably quite nice that it was there. It allowed me to have a better sense of myself, maybe other people I could identify with. It was very moving.
I was there that day myself, and despite having campaigned against them, I was surprised at the impact the departure of the Americans had on everyone around the loch. A big part of our lives had gone forever. It was an emotional day. Long before the US submarines made the loch a little less than holy, these sheltered waters were a haven of peace. 1400 years ago, the Celtic St Mun established a religious community on the shores of the Holy Loch at a place known today as Kilmun.
This is the holy ground beside the Holy Loch, which for generations has been a burial place for the great and the good, the poor and the wicked.
The graveyard and mausoleum are the final resting place of many of the dukes and earls of Argyll. But I have to say that I'm less interested in the dead than in the music that may have accompanied them to the grave. Entering the old kirk, I follow the sound of heavenly music and find a man with the biggest organ I've ever seen in Argyll. This impressive instrument is powered in a very interesting and unique way. Frank Barclay reveals the inner mechanisms hidden downstairs.
Wow, that is some machine.
That is the original water engine put in 1909 when the organ was installed. As far as we know, there are only 2 left in Scotland.
It's an amazingly simple contraption. The water's filling the cylinder and forcing the piston up, and the piston is compressing these bellows I can see up in the roof.
Yes, that's right. The only problem with it is that it's much dearer to run than an electric fan. Which is
Water
why
is free, surely.
Churches were originally charged an industrial water rate for using all this
You're
water.
joking, really?
Because these water engines were also used to give intermittent power, as in running lifts in tall buildings in Edwardian and Victorian times. These were thrown out all over the country, and only for various sort of esoteric reasons did a few remain.
So it's amazing.
And this is one of them.
Well, I think it's a magnificent machine, and we can put it back in its box.
Yeah.
And may it continue
May it continue
working
for...
its magic for years to come.
Well, we hope so.
The water organ has a pedigree almost as old as my next destination, where I swap the element of water for the fires of the god Vulcan. In the village of Sandbank, on the other side of the loch, I come to the flames and smoke of Vulcan Place, a blacksmith's that's been in the same family for 6 generations. Finlay Curry's great-great-great-grandfather worked at the very same anvil where Finlay still practices his ancient craft.
So when your ancestor moved here, what kind of work was he doing?
At the time when he started the smithy here, there was a gunpowder mill at Glen Lane, and they say there was over 100 horses working in the mill. They said that some of the ponies that worked inside the mill, their shoes had to be made of brass.
Really?
So there'd be no sparks for the explosion.
Of course, yeah. You wouldn't necessarily think of that, would you, until it was too late?
No, no.
So Finlay, when the Americans were in the Holy Loch, they must have given you some work,
They
did
did.
they not?
They did. We got a lot of work from the Americans, and we worked very closely with them. It was a great job because they eat a lot of food. So for 10 o'clock tea break, we had sirloin steaks about this size.
For tea break?
For tea break. Yeah.
Well, as a blacksmith, you need to sort of build up the muscle.
Yeah.
That's one way of doing it.
So these are just the scroll ends to go on an ornamental railing.
It's like a shepherd's crook now, that scroll.
That's right. That's what we call it. We're wanting to bring this round a wee bit more. Just make the scroll a wee bit bigger.
Right, so you want me to hit it
So,
there?
Yeah, but just like
A
that.
gentle
So,
brush
yeah,
stroke. Go
use
on,
that
right.
hammer and
Right,
just,
okay.
that's it. A bit harder, come on, a bit harder. A bit harder.
Have to be 2 hands.
So
That's not very good, is it? There?
Oh, we'll sort that out, don't worry.
Leaving Finlay to forge ahead without my interference, I head up the road to Benmore Botanic Gardens, where Finlay's traditional skills were used to restore a beautiful piece of ironmongery.
Now, these are the famous Benmore Golden Gates, made possible by the insatiable desire of the British Empire for sweet things and the genius of a man called James Duncan.
Duncan was an innovative sugar refiner and began his career across the Firth of Clyde in Greenock. he amassed a fortune processing sugar without using slaves, and bought the magnificent Benmore estate, where his passion for collecting trees and ferns blossomed.
And we're in. Kind of like Heaven's Gate.
But his most outstanding collection were his paintings and sculptures, and he built a gigantic gallery beside Benmore House to contain them. I join art historian Dr. Andrew Watson to pace out the area where the now demolished gallery would have stood.
Now, Andrew, we've got a very handy tape measure here.
Yeah, sure.
So you're saying it was what, 40?
About 48 metres, 160 feet.
Right. Well, I'll hold one end.
Okay, I'll take this, yeah.
Okay. Off we go.
Yes.
Did it have a lot of paintings to house in this gallery, did it?
They numbered over 300 when it was fully furnished. That's us at 26.
Really?
Yeah.
It's
Still got
colossal.
quite a bit to go.
Yeah. It's only when you really see it paced out like this, you get a real sense of how huge it was.
Absolutely enormous. That's us at 40 metres there.
40 metres, another 8. He's quite an innovative collector.
Very much so, very broad-ranging, and he wanted his collection to be representative of all the major schools in the 19th century. And here we are, the full extent of Benmore Picture Gallery.
That is amazing. That's
It's absolutely
amazing,
astonishing,
Andrew.
isn't it?
He must have had some pretty big paintings.
Well, in 1875, we know he bought a painting by an Austrian artist called Hans Mackart, and that is 8 metres long.
That's almost the length of a double-decker bus.
It's amazing to think that world-class paintings were actually housed in a building here in
Yes.
Benmore Gardens.
Yes, a truly international
Not
collection.
far from Dunoon.
Exactly, yes.
Tragically, the sugar market collapsed in the same year that Duncan finally completed his collection. Facing bankruptcy, he was forced to sell off the estate and the contents of his cherished gallery.
His whole vision was to leave this whole place to the nation, including the picture gallery.
So we're all the poorer, really.
We certainly are, we certainly are. I mean, this collection, had it stayed intact, would have been as important as any of the major ones you can think of, like the Burrell or the Tate. It was truly a world-class collection.
It's sad that Duncan's philanthropic dream was snatched from him, but it's fitting that the garden is now open to the public. Continuing my journey, I head up Loch to Glenbranter, a place once associated with the world's first truly international superstar, Harry Lauder. Famous, among other numbers, for Stop Your Tickling Jock and Roaming in the Gloaming.
In the early years of the 20th century, Harry Lauder bought land around Glenbranter here for his son John, hoping to set him up as a Highland laird. Now, John was a well-connected young man, and he studied at Cambridge University and joined the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders as a junior officer in the Territorial Army. So he had all the makings of being quite a gentleman.
Tragically, he was killed by a sniper in 1916, just 2 years after the outbreak of the First World War. His death broke his father's heart. Harry built this monument to commemorate John's short life. It overlooks the lands where John was set to make his home before a bullet cut short his life and his father's dreams. Crossing the hills from Loch I take a road known locally as the Larach.
This is a route I used to know well because when I was a boy, this was the road home to Ardentiny.
Harry Lauder must have known this road too. He wrote a song with the immortal lines, "O'er the hill to Ardentiny."
O'er the hill to Ardentiny, I would walk 100 miles.
Well, it's nothing like 100 miles, more like 5. and it takes me down memory lane to the village on the shores of Loch Long where I grew up in the 1970s. My parents ran the Ardentini Hotel, where I worked in the holidays along with the rest of the staff. And I went to school just a few hundred metres or so up the road.
Now that's my old school, and when I was a wee boy there was just one teacher, Miss McFarlane, and one classroom. And when I was in primary 7 I was the only pupil, and that's the only time I've ever come top of the class.
The old pier below the school once served a ferry which crossed the loch in former times. To call it, a signal fire was lit on a point to attract attention. In Gaelic, Ardentini means the point of the fire.
No ferries across the loch today, which incidentally has nothing to do with its length. Loch Long in Gaelic means the ship loch and recalls the days of Viking longships when they ravaged this coast.
To explore the loch further, I've come aboard a little longship of sorts. Not exactly a Viking longship, but a wooden type of boat called a Loch Long. Owner Erin MacLeod explains the association.
So what's the connection between Loch Long and this boat?
They were built specifically Loch Longs for the lovely Loch Long.
But there's a Scandinavian connection as well, I understand.
Yes, the design was possibly taken from a Scandinavian design and is designed to be a boat for everybody, to be able to have one and to maintain them themselves.
How did you come by this boat?
For my 16th birthday, my father decided to buy me a Loch Long, but I had no mast because he had taken the mast himself for his own boat.
Well, he wanted it for spare.
Yes, indeed.
He was going to cannibalise your present.
Yes. But then what happened was I met my now husband and we rebuilt her together, built her over 3 years. And we are now married, so it must have been good. It must have worked out okay.
A labour of love.
Indeed,
Yeah.
indeed she is.
And we've got a hint of wind here, Ellen. And we may possibly begin to sail if I can trim up here.
Sailing on Loch Long, in a Loch Long, is a moment of pure nostalgia for me. As a boy, I sailed these waters with my father, and I still can't think of a better way of passing the time than messing about in boats. My grand tour now sails grandly up Loch Long, past its junction with Loch Goil and on to Aracha, surrounded by high mountains known somewhat dramatically as the Aracha Alps.
For most people in industrial Scotland, these rugged little hills were the closest they would ever get to real alpine adventure. But readily accessible to the cities of the Central Belt, they were small enough to be climbed in a day, yet challenging enough to get the adrenaline pumping.
And for those with a desire for adventure, the hill that drew their eye was the rocky summit of Ben Arthur, known affectionately as the Cobbler. Joining me on the path up the hill is mountaineering historian Ken Crockett.
Who were the climbers who were coming up here in the 1920s and 30s, Ken?
They were for the most part working class, and those that had a job were working in the shipyards and the engineering sheds. Those that had a job, that is. Many were unemployed because conditions were hard at this time.
Were they trying to escape, do you think?
Well, that was one large area of it. The cities were pretty grimy and horrible. Housing was very short. If you had a house, it might only have one room. It was an escape, definitely an escape from the cities. But the other side to it was the politics, because politics in Britain were very hot at that time. Socialism was very much on the rise, and many of these guys were socialists.
Right, so there's a political dimension to this as well.
There's a strong political dimension, which in some ways became stronger.
At about the halfway point along the path, we come across several gigantic rocks known as the Narnain boulders.
Ken, it's really significant, this boulder, isn't it?
It is in Scottish mountaineering history, yeah. Because 1925, a group of young climbers, most of them from Glasgow, some from Edinburgh, spent their first meet here of the new club they'd formed, the JMCS, the Junior Mountaineering Club of Scotland. And after the First World War, not much was being done, if anything. People were demoralised, tired, exhausted. Climbing was just the same.
So they were injecting new blood and enthusiasm into the sport.
Very much so. From then on, mountaineering started accelerating, greater numbers and expertise and so on in Scotland.
I think we should bash on.
I think we should. The weather's still keeping up, so let's go for it, shall we?
Okie doke. I'll follow you.
Pushing onwards, we reach the ridge, surrounded by not one, but 3 summits, the north, south and central peaks. The north and south offer some challenging climbing routes, but we're heading to the highest one, the central peak.
Ken, we've scrambled over these boulders,
Yeah.
and this is the summit. This is the true summit.
This big block is part of the true summit. The true summit, of course, is the top of this block.
Right.
And we're almost at the summit.
And to access it, you have to go through what I think is called Argyll's eyeglass. Is that right?
Yes, and the story goes, those who are a prospective chief of the Clan Campbell have to crawl through this, make the exposed traverse across behind it, and stand on the actual summit.
Right. Now, fortunately, I'm not a Campbell, and I've done it anyway, so I guess I'm exempt.
Okay.
Good luck. I'm going to go and find an easier summit.
This is the awkward bit.
Ken makes it through the eyeglass, but stops to take a rest on the exposed ledge leading to the true summit. It looks an airy perch.
I'm coming up to a much easier summit to admire the view, which is, as ever, absolutely glorious. You can see all the way down the ship Loch Long to the Firth of Clyde and the Kyles of Bute in the beginning of my journey. And I can't think of a better place to end my grand tour of the People's Lochs than here on top of the Cobbler. Hi, Ken.
Hi, Paul.
My next grand tour takes me from the Loch of the Lows through Edinburgh's Lost Lochs to the ancient kingdom of Fife.
Susan Kelman charms the terrified but ambitious chefs as they create works of culinary art. Great British Menu next. And on BBC One now, goods tinged with emotion come back to life, awarded Best Daytime Programme, The Repair Shop.